So let's reveal the first secret. Secret number 1. Secret of what real money is. Everybody wants more money, but do we understand what money really is? To understand, we need to step back in time and look at what the difference is between money and currency. Once we unlock this secret, I promise you, you'll never look at money the same way again. The only difference between money and currency is that money has a store of value, meaning you can store it and retrieve it at a later date, and it will be still useful. Let me repeat that again. Money is when you can store it and retrieve it at a later date, and it will be still useful. So what is currency, and where did currency come from? Currency is that paper stuff you carry around in your wallet. And it all started some 500 years before Christ with the goldsmiths, where they were melting gold and silver down to make coins. Coins were used in exchange for goods and services. Similar to today, when we go to the local grocer to buy our fruit and vegetables, we exchange our paper money or currency to pay for those goods. As time went on, people accumulated more and more gold and silver coins. The main problem with gold and silver is that it is very heavy and not convenient to carry around, and people did not have a secure place to hold these coins. The goldsmith would hold more gold than a normal person to create the coins and stored his gold in a vault. There are no records of the first storage event, but you can imagine it would have played out something like this. Once upon a time, there was a goldsmith who had a wealthy farmer friend who sold sheep at the local markets, where he had customers who paid in gold or silver coins for his meat. This farmer slowly accumulated enough coins that it was no longer safe to keep it under his pillow at night. So the farmer asked his friend, the goldsmith, if he could keep his gold and silver coins in his vault. Later the farmer told one of his friends that he stores his gold and silver in a safe location with the goldsmith. The farmer's friend, who the goldsmith didn't know, also wanted to store his gold in the goldsmith's vault. The goldsmith agreed, but this time the farmer's friend had to pay rent for the space within the vault. In return, the goldsmith gave the farmer's friend a receipt, or an IOU, for the gold and silver that was stored in his vault. As more and more people found out about this safe location to store their gold and silver, the more and more IOUs were given out to the general public. People ended up trusting these goldsmiths' IOUs and started exchanging them for goods and services. So you could pay for the farmer's meat in an IOU rather than gold or silver coins. These goldsmiths' IOUs became more and more common and accepted means of payment, because the people knew that they could go down to the goldsmith's vault and retrieve their gold and silver coins by handing the goldsmith's IOU to the goldsmith in return for their gold and silver. The IOUs at this stage were 100% gold backed, meaning if all the IOUs were handed back to the goldsmith, he could supply all his customers with their gold and silver. The goldsmith's IOUs was the birth of the first paper currency and the first bank. Over time, the goldsmiths realized that it was rare for a majority of the customers to come down to the vault and collect their gold and silver. Greed set in, and the goldsmiths found another avenue to make more money. The goldsmith knew how much gold he would require to hold in reserves to serve his customers. So he made a simple calculation on how much gold and silver he would need to have in his vault at any one time to serve his customers. The amount above could be loaned against. So the goldsmith started loaning out more IOUs with a promise to pay plus interest. So the goldsmith would make a much larger percentage with his vault and new merchant banking business. This was the birth of fractional reserve banking. This system works until all the customers line up at the goldsmith's vault and demand to withdraw all their gold and silver deposits at the same time. This is called a run on the bank and would put a bank out of business. In summary, real money is where each IOU or bank loan is equal to the deposited amount of gold and silver. Fractional reserve banking is where you have multiple IOUs with a fraction of the holdings is deposited or held by the bank. Fractional reserve banking became legal in the 19th century in England and remains legal today in America and Australia and in nearly every country around the world. The percentage used to be 10%, meaning that the bank would require to hold 10% of the gold for the amount they loaned out, but today there is no reserves. Yes, that paper money you hold in your wallet today is worth nothing, zero, zip. Which leads us into the next problem, fiat currency. Fiat currency all started with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, where President Richard Nixon on the 15th of August 1971 announced the temporary suspension of the dollars convertible into gold. This bill that was passed meant that money did not require the partial backing of gold, which allows the Federal Reserve to print money today out of thin air, creating a fiat currency supply. Mike Maloney, author of Guide to Investing in Gold and Silver and owner of goldsilver.com, explains fiat currency very simply using a flow diagram. Fiat currency is created by a treasury who writes an IOU for, say, $1 trillion plus interest, which is called a bond, and hands it to a Federal Reserve Bank. The Federal Reserve Bank then writes the check of, say, $1 trillion back to the government. This money then springs into existence through government allocations like buildings, contracts, war, and wages for government employees. This money then goes into the hands of the people through their work or businesses, which is then deposited back into the public banks. The banks are then allowed to lend out 90% of what was deposited. Say, for example, $100,000 was deposited. Then the bank is allowed to lend out another $90,000. Then the customer uses this money to buy a house or a car. Then the seller would deposit that $90,000 into his bank, which that bank can lend out 90% of that $90,000, and on it goes. This means for every $1 created, the banks can create another $10. So even though the Federal Reserve created $1 trillion, the banks will turn this into another $10 trillion. And interest that is paid back on that $1 trillion loan is paid with your hard-earned taxes. In essence, the Federal Reserve is buying our debt and profiting from it big time. But it was not always the case that the Federal Reserve had to buy back our own debt. Until recently, the biggest buyer has been China of around $1.2 trillion of bonds and another $3.2 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. China sees that the US dollar's future is coming to an end, and we think the same, and they are taking things into their own hands. Normally to sell these US dollars, the Chinese would sell them on the Forex or the foreign exchange. But with over $3 trillion in their possession, if they were to put this on the Forex all at once, it would devalue the US dollar at an alarming rate, rendering their $3 trillion to be worth nothing. So the Chinese, being smart, are getting rid of their US dollars by buying commodities that are going to hold their value, like gold, silver, oil, wheat, and barley. So what damage has the fiat currency done to the US? Here is a chart of the national debt in the US, which displays the US debt since 1965. You can see it took over 50 years to grow our debt to $7 trillion. And just in the last 10 years, we have doubled our debt to $14 trillion. And more recently, the debt ceiling has been raised another $2.1 trillion. Today, the US has a GDP of $14.6 trillion per year of debt. And as I mentioned before, our debt level is $14.3 trillion, and the spending projections for this year is going to be another $1.8 trillion, which will leave the US just shy of $16 trillion, which means the US debt is more than the entire country's GDP for the entire year. Traditionally, when the debt to GDP ratio surpasses 90%, this is a fate of no return for a country. Now US joins the countries like Japan at 229% of the GDP, Greece at 152% of the GDP, Jamaica at 137%, Lebanon at 134%, Italy at 120%, Ireland at 114%, Iceland at 103%. This is absolutely insane because to prevent the US economy from collapsing, the Federal Reserve has to print more money out of thin air. Now, when the Federal Reserve does this, this actually devalues every other dollar that is already in existence, reducing your buying power of your existing dollars, making your dollars in your bank account worth less. As mentioned, this process is called inflation. This graph shows you how much currency the Federal Reserve has been printing since 1913 to 2011. Now, if you look closely, it took the Federal Reserve from 1913 to 2010 to print just over $800 billion. And just in the last year, the Federal Reserve has doubled that to over $2.1 trillion in total, or to prevent the economy from going into another recession. This is rapidly reducing the value of your money. Here is a chart which shows you the devaluing of the dollar over the past 10 years. In fact, the US dollar has lost 15% of its purchasing power in the past 12 months. Now, because there is 70% of the world's currency in the US dollars, and in effect what happens to the US dollar, it has a major influence on every other currency within the world. This has forced just about every other country that exports goods to crank up their printing presses as well. If they don't, then their dollar will become stronger than the US dollar, reducing their exports, which leads to less GDP for their country, preventing economic growth, which will cause deflationary effect in their domestic economy, preventing them to grow, which will cause deflation in their economy. Now, with all countries printing at the same time, it is destined for all countries to suffer from hyperinflation at the same time in the near future. Now, hyperinflation is a country's worst nightmare, but it is not uncommon either. Hyperinflation reduces the buying power of currency. So your $100 note today may only buy you a loaf of bread in the future. Now, this is not uncommon. Hyperinflation has happened in many countries around the world before. Here are some countries where hyperinflation has occurred. France in 1793 with 5 leviers, Germany with 1 billion mark in 1923, Greece in 1943, Hungary in 1945, the Central Bank of China in 1947, Chile in 1975, Bolivia in 1985, Argentina in 1985 as well, Peru in 1989 with 100,000. Nicaragua with a $10 million note in 1990. Zaire in 1992. Russia in 1992. Brazil in 1993. Bosnia in 1993. Georgia in 1994. Ukraine in 95. Angola in 95 as well. Belarus in 96. Turkey in 97. Romania in 2001. Venezuela in 2002. And with Zimbabwe with a record $100 trillion note. And if you think this won't happen to the US, well, it has already happened twice. Once in the Revolution War and in the Civil War. Falling currency and sales leads to unemployment and reduced salaries, which means less money spent, creating a downward spiral on the economy. So let's have a look at what the real unemployment figures actually are, because those figures that are presented to us in the media are not entirely correct. What the government conveniently forgets to include are the people who have not looked for a job in more than 30 days, or on the other hand, those who have got part-time jobs. Because they want to perceive that things are not as bad as it seems. But guess what? Things are getting pretty bad. So if we feel bad with these figures from the government, then you'll be shocked with this graph. Real unemployment sits around 23%, and unemployment during the Great Depression sat around 24%. This graph shows you unemployment over the past 70 years, and it really demonstrates the severity of our situation. The vertical grey shadowed lines indicates recessions. We are already sitting at the highest levels of unemployment since the Great Depression, and we haven't felt the real impact of this depression yet. Well, everything is not all doom and gloom.